to hold themselves to their own standards.
The shelling of a UN facility is totally unacceptable and totally indefensible.
Statements made repeatedly now by the Obama administration on Israel's actions in Gaza, culminating in this from the State Department Sunday. The United States is appalled by today's disgraceful shelling. Now, that's not to say the U.S. hasn't also verbally slammed Hamas. And the White House's take on U.S.-Israel relations today?
The nature of our relationship is strong and unchanged.
But what's also unchanged is the tension that's been there. Analysts say President Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu despise each other.
Perception is often 99% of reality. Thus is the downfall of a society so based on 20-second sound bites and internet rumor mongering. And in the case of the latest battle and ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, there has likely never been a better example of cutting that difference. Israel insists they are doing what is necessary to protect their country. Hamas and the Palestinians insist they are fighting occupation and an aggressor. And a former American president hasn't helped matters any with a statement seen by many as so incredibly wrong. It's difficult to believe he has any understanding of what reality is. Let's start by welcoming to MidPoint the senior writer for HumanEvents.com, John Hayward, joins us. John, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
John, I want to start out right away with an article from New York Magazine and the headline on it itself that maybe sets the tone here. Telegenically dead Palestinians. Why Israel is losing the American media war. There seems to be the thought here that simply because the world does not see bleeding on the streets of Jerusalem, that it's all going against Israel, and that's the reason why they're losing the media war. Fair to say?
That is fair to say, and that was the Hamas strategy all along. They controlled the media environment in the Gaza, and you'll notice that when reporters get close to reporting something bad for them, they get threatened. Reporters will talk about Hamas threatening to kill them if they show pictures of rocket launchers being set up in dense civilian areas. And the fact that Israel has an effective missile defense has made this a story about dead people in Gaza driving the media narrative. But I think all that changed with the discovery of the tunnels. The tunnels in Gaza are the thing that really frightened the Israelis and changed the character of the conflict, and it's changed the media environment as well.
Did it really, though? Because there seems to be, again, that thinking process that we are still seeing shelling in the Gaza Strip, and they still see women and children. There's also women and children. I want to get to that in a moment as well. But they're still seeing the quote-unquote innocents here, and all they are seeing on the other side of the world are empty tunnels, and they're not really seeing much else. So isn't Israel still needing to, it's a terrible thing to say, but when you're at war and you're still looking for that public support, you've got to play the media game, and Israel's not playing it well.
Well, that's true. Equivalency is a form of legitimacy. To say that Hamas and Israel is equivalent is monstrously wrong, but that's their objective. They wanted to see that there are people dying in Gaza, so Israel is wrong, and maybe that means Hamas is a little wrong for shooting their rockets, but they're all equally wrong, and that's not true. That's the victory condition, the end game for Hamas, and unfortunately, I think our administration fell for that up until now. Starting today, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, has started talking a bit tougher about Hamas for the first time, which I think is a sea change in the administration's attitude.
Why is it then that smart people in the administration here didn't get it before today if John Kerry is just talking about it now? You would think that people who know foreign policy, or at least are charged with knowing foreign policy, would make better decisions well before this time.
Well, one of the clips you played at the introduction made the point that there's personal animosity between President Obama and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That's part of it. But the other part is that it's easier to use smart power on the good guys. If you believe in influencing things by public statements and Twitter hashtags, social media, all the things that are part of smart power for this administration, you're wasting your time talking to Hamas. They don't care about your hashtags, but the Israelis will listen to you, and you can posture as if you're influencing the debate by leaning on them. They are the easier target for this administration's form of diplomacy.
Here's a great quote that came out on July 30th from Ilana Stein, a spokesperson for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, talking here to the JNS, and I quote, you won't be able to see it, but our audience will here. For years, our diplomats around the world have been saying that Hamas is a terrorist organization. The international community didn't understand why we wouldn't let Hamas bring in cement to Gaza a few years ago. Now you all know why, so that's a success for us. But is it really a success, though, when we're still talking about this social media video war?
Well, they have to defend that success. That's exactly the problem. They can't just say it once and let it lie there. They have to push that point repeatedly, put out pictures of the Hamas terror tunnels, which, if you've seen them, are not these little dirt tunnels that run a couple of 100 feet. They're gigantic. They're like the Mines of Moria from Lord of the Rings. They run for miles, and they were running into Israeli territories, bracketing Israeli villages that were going to be wiped out in this spate of terror attacks planned for Rosh Hashanah this year. The Israelis have to make that point and explain that that's why the Gaza blockade must remain in place. The administration and Hamas are still trying to get that blockade lifted. And at this point, that would be a hideous tactical mistake for the Israelis.
Let's talk, though, about social media a little bit, because as you mentioned, and we've talked about it here on the show as well, Hamas is doing a brilliant job in the minds of those, and I've talked to several social media folks who say that they're doing it almost as if they have a PR/marketing person sitting there and knowing exactly what's necessary and what the world wants to hear. Are we now ushering ourselves into a new theater of war where we're going to see Hamas do it? And why not? Well, why not? ISIS is doing it as well in another part of the country, so another part of the world, rather. So we are seeing a lot smarter terrorists these days that is playing on American and global emotions using social media, right?
Well, I'm sure that's literally true. They do have PR people that know what they're doing. They go to school. They're not stupid. They've shrewdly assessed the global media situation, and they know they have a very easy battlefield for media conflict because they control the media out of Gaza. The press keeps acting surprised when Hamas rockets go off behind them. You've seen this half a dozen times now. They're doing a report from Gaza, and they cringe when a rocket blows up right behind them because that wasn't supposed to be on the cameras. Hamas controls this environment, and they know that they can play tough and control and shape what the media says without paying much of a price. They've even used pictures of dead people from Syria to make their point and claim they were victims of Israeli shelling, and the media just uncritically repeats those pictures. They just accept this tidal wave of disinformation.
This is a terrible thing to guess here and to talk about, but when we see these pictures, when we see Hamas words, when there is social media out there, are the Israelis missing the boat here, and should they maybe be on the other side? Again, I know this is going to be abhorrent to so many people here, but if they had Twitter, Facebook showing, here's what we did, here's what we stopped, here are the tunnels, here are the people that we killed, the terrorists that we killed that could have killed us, might that not be the smart thing to do if they're fighting this social media war?
They do that. The Israeli Defense Force has a very active Twitter account with a large following, and they do exactly what you said. They've put out pictures of the tunnels, they've put out their side of the story, and before this conflict began, the IDF Twitter feed every day was talking about all the humanitarian supplies they were distributing in Gaza.
But why are those not getting as much attention as the Hamas Twitter feeds and the Hamas pictures? Those seem to be buried.
It's media slanted. It's media biased. The media doesn't want to relay that side of the story because it's much easier to beat up on the Israelis and tell the Hamas side. And the Israelis also don't do this full court press. They wouldn't do something like take pictures of dead people in Syria and claim they were victims of Hamas. Hamas does that. It's a full frontal assault from one side, a more restrained response from the other. And I think the Israelis all along are still trying to preserve that sense of legitimacy. That's what Hamas wants. And if the media buys into their side of the story and grants them legitimacy, they're going to be the long-term winners of this.
All right, John Hayward, we thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be talking about this again. We'll talk to you again very soon.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you very much, John. On to the Opinionator for what we have just heard. Welcome into MidPoint, syndicated nationally via outlets such as TuneIn, Live 365, and his website. Brett Winterble joins the fray. Brett, thanks so much for being here.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Brett, what you have just heard here is Israel simply is losing the social media war. That's a terrible thing to say when you've got people dying on both sides, but it is a fact. The world responds to social media, do they not?
The world does respond to social media, but I think it depends on who that audience is. Look, most Americans are firm supporters of Israel. Younger people tend to be more swayed by the social media sort of posts on Facebook, on Twitter, on things like that. But the reality is, the average American in the street, if you ask them whether they support Hamas or support Israel and the IDF in this battle, overwhelmingly support the Israelis. NBC Wall Street Journal just came out with a poll in the last 12, 18 hours showing that number. When you mentioned to John Hayward the fact that John Kerry has suddenly started to change his tune and take a more aggressive stance against Hamas, I think that's borne out by a poll-driven administration who sees that the popular sentiment is not with Hamas, is not with the people in Gaza. It's with the Israelis. We have a deep and abiding cultural, religious connection to the people of Israel. The people that call into my show that are weighing in on this are passionate supporters. You've seen a tremendous failure, I think, by Hamas in selling them as the victims. Now, certainly the people of Gaza are victims. Of that, I have no doubt, Ed. But we don't know who killed those civilians that are appearing in those shots. It could be misfired Hamas rockets. It could be Hamas gunmen. I don't put anything past this Iranian-sponsored terrorist group when it comes to massacring innocent people to try to advance their message. So while social media is playing a role, you have to understand that there is a lot more transparency coming out of the IDF and out of Israel than you are ever getting out of Hamas.
Fred, unfortunately, we're all out of time, but I have to ask you something very quickly. 10-second answer, if you would. Jimmy Carter said only by recognizing its legitimacy as a potential actor, speaking of Hamas, can the West begin to provide the right incentives for them to lay down their weapons? Quick, your reaction.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Hamas is a terrorist organization. The people of Gaza are suffering. The Palestinian people, I guess, are suffering. But Hamas is an Iranian state-sponsored terror group. They are never going to back down from their weapons. It's about power. It's about body count.
Fred, we'll do it again real soon. Thanks for your opinion.
Thank you, Ed.
The Opinionator's in. Later on this hour, is it possible for the American public to actually trust those who tell us there's no reason to panic about Ebola coming to American shores? That's coming up right here on MidPoint, where we question everything.